Your doctor looks at your chart and says, "Let's run a few extra tests, just to be safe." That phrase sounds harmless, responsible even, but what happens next is something most people never expect. A few weeks later, you get a call. Something showed up, not something you felt, not something that was bothering you, just something. And from that moment, everything starts moving. More tests, more appointments, more decisions. And suddenly, a person who felt completely fine is now inside a system that doesn't easily slow down once it starts. I want you to understand something important. This situation is not rare. It happens more often than most people realize, and it doesn't happen because medicine is bad. It happens because the way we evaluate risk changes as we age, but that change is not always discussed clearly. My name is Dr. Natalie Brooks, and what I focus on is helping people understand how health decisions shift after 60, and especially after 70. Because what helps at 50 does not always help at 70, and sometimes the difference is not small. Before we go into specific tests, I want to give you one concept, because without it, everything else will sound confusing. I call it the longevity lens. When you are younger, screening works very well. You find something early, you treat it, you prevent future problems. The benefit is clear. But as we get older, 3 things begin to change. First, not everything that is found actually needs to be treated. Some conditions develop slowly. So slowly, in fact, that they may never affect your life in a meaningful way. But once they are discovered, they often trigger action. And that action may not always be necessary. Second, the body responds differently to intervention. A procedure that is relatively easy to recover from at 50 may take much longer and carry more risk at 75. Recovery is different, tolerance is different, and outcomes are different. Third, and this is the one most people don't expect, there is something called a cascade effect. One test leads to another. That leads to a procedure. That leads to a complication. And suddenly, the original reason for the test is no longer the main issue. The process itself becomes the problem. That's the lens I want you to keep in mind as we go forward. Because today, I'm going to walk you through 5 common medical checkups that many people assume are always beneficial, but after a certain age may need to be reconsidered depending on your situation. For each one, I'll explain why the benefit may change, what the risks actually are, and what you can ask your doctor to make a better decision. And I recommend staying with me all the way to the end, because the final section is not about a test. It's about a way of asking questions that can completely change how your next appointment goes. Now let's begin with the first checkup, one that almost everyone is familiar with. Let's start with something many people consider routine and often don't question: colonoscopy. For years, it has been presented as one of the most important preventive screenings, and for a certain age group, that is absolutely true. But what matters here is timing, because after a certain point, the balance between benefit and risk begins to shift. Let me explain this through a real-life type of situation. Imagine a woman in her late 70s. She's had previous screenings earlier in life, all normal. No symptoms, no family history. She feels fine, but during a routine visit, she's told she's due for another test. And because she trusts the recommendation, she agrees. Now, what many people don't realize is that the preparation process alone, the part that happens before the procedure, can be physically demanding. It involves clearing the digestive system, often leading to significant fluid loss. For a younger person, that may be uncomfortable but manageable. For someone older, it can place real stress on the body. Dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, weakness, or dizziness. These are not rare reactions, especially in older adults. And sometimes, the preparation itself becomes more challenging than the procedure. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Screening tests are designed to detect problems early, before symptoms appear. But here's the key question. If something is found, does it actually need to be treated? because not everything that is detected will go on to cause harm. Some conditions develop so slowly that they may never affect a person's life, especially later in life. But once something appears on a report, it often leads to further steps. Follow-up procedures, interventions, and each step carries its own level of risk. For older adults, even small risks can become more significant. Recovery takes longer. The body is more sensitive to stress. So the decision is no longer just about finding something early. It becomes about whether finding it will actually improve outcomes. That's the part many people are never fully told. Now, this does not mean the test is always unnecessary. There are situations where it is still important. If there are symptoms, changes in digestion, unexplained discomfort, or other warning signs, that changes the equation completely. But in someone who feels well and has a history of normal results, the conversation becomes more nuanced. This is where asking the right questions matters. Questions like, what is the actual benefit of repeating this test at my age? What are the risks in my specific situation? Are there less invasive ways to monitor things? Because in many cases, there are alternatives that involve less strain on the body, and those options are worth discussing. The key idea here is not to avoid care, but to make sure the care you receive is appropriate for your stage of life. Now let's move to the next category. This one is more complex because it involves something everyone fears: cancer. And this is where understanding the difference between detection and outcome becomes extremely important. In many cases, it has saved lives. But like everything else we're discussing today, context matters. And after a certain age, the conversation changes. Let me explain why. Modern imaging technology is incredibly sensitive. It can detect very small abnormalities, sometimes at an extremely early stage. At first, that sounds like a clear advantage. But here's the part most people are never told. Not every abnormality that is found will go on to cause harm. Some changes in the body develop very slowly, so slowly in fact that they may never affect a person's health within their lifetime. But once something is detected and labeled, the system responds. There are follow-ups, more tests, possible treatments. And this is where things become complicated, because the discovery itself can lead to interventions that may not have been necessary. I recommend thinking of it this way. There is a difference between something existing and something becoming a problem. And medicine is very good at finding things, sometimes better than it is at deciding what truly needs action. Let me give you an example scenario. Imagine someone in their late 70s, feeling well, staying active. A routine screening shows a small abnormality, nothing aggressive, nothing urgent. But now it has a name, and once it has a name, it becomes very difficult to ignore, even if the likelihood of it causing harm is low. So treatment becomes part of the conversation. And treatment always comes with trade-offs: fatigue, changes in daily function, possible long-term effects. So the question becomes, did the screening improve the outcome? Or did it introduce a new set of challenges that may not have been necessary? This is what is often referred to as overdiagnosis. Finding something that, while real, may never have impacted your life if it had remained undetected. And once it's found, it's very hard to simply leave it alone. Now again, this does not mean screening should never happen. There are situations where it is absolutely appropriate. If there is a strong family history, specific risk factors, or symptoms that need investigation, then screening plays a very important role. But for individuals who are feeling well and have no specific risk factors, the decision becomes more individualized. And that's where a conversation with your doctor becomes essential. Not just, should I do this test? But, what happens if something is found? Would treatment actually improve my quality of life? Or would monitoring be a reasonable option? Because sometimes, understanding the next step is more important than the test itself. Now let's move to the next checkup. This one often feels like a simple precaution, something people do just to be safe. But the data behind it tells a more complicated story. Now let's talk about a test that sounds extremely reasonable on the surface: a heart check. specifically a cardiac stress test. For many people, this feels like a responsible step. You're getting older, so you check your heart just to be safe. That logic makes sense. But here's where things become more complex. A stress test is designed to detect how your heart responds under pressure. Sometimes it involves walking on a treadmill. Other times, medication is used to simulate that stress. Either way, the goal is to look for signs that something might not be functioning optimally. Now, this type of test can be very useful when there are symptoms: chest discomfort, shortness of breath, unexplained fatigue during activity. In those cases, the test helps answer a specific question. But when there are no symptoms, the situation changes. Because tests like this can sometimes detect variations that may not actually represent a serious problem. And once something appears unusual, even if it's not dangerous, it often leads to the next step: more detailed procedures. And those procedures are not minor. They can involve entering the vascular system, examining the heart more directly, and potentially identifying areas that look narrowed or restricted. Now here's the important part. Changes in blood vessels are very common with age. In many cases, they develop gradually and do not cause symptoms. They may remain stable for years, but once they are seen, they can lead to further intervention. And that intervention may or may not improve long-term outcomes. So again, we come back to the same question. Is the test helping guide necessary care, or is it starting a process that might not have been needed? Because once that process begins, it can be difficult to stop. Follow-up procedures often come with their own risks, and for older adults, even small risks deserve careful consideration. So what's the alternative? Instead of looking for problems without symptoms, the focus often shifts toward managing known risk factors. Things like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, blood sugar, physical activity, sleep quality. These are areas where consistent attention can make a meaningful difference over time. Now, this doesn't mean the test should never be done. If symptoms are present, it can be extremely important. But without symptoms, it becomes a conversation, not an automatic step. And that conversation should include: what are we looking for? What would we do if we find it? Will that action actually improve my outcome? Now let's move to the next topic. This one is especially important because it relates to long-term health and how we think about prevention. But it also shows how sometimes the solution we expect is not always the most effective one. Now let's talk about something that feels very preventive, something that sounds like you're protecting your future. Bone density testing, often followed by medication. At first glance, this seems like a clear benefit. As we age, bone strength naturally decreases. And preventing fractures is extremely important. There's no question about that. But here's where the conversation becomes more nuanced. A bone density scan can show that your bones are less dense than before. And based on that result, medication is often recommended. That step can feel automatic. Scan, result, prescription. But what's often not fully discussed is this. Medication is only one part of the picture, and in some cases, not always the most impactful one. Because when it comes to fractures, the biggest factor is not just bone density, it's falling. Most fractures in older adults happen after a fall. So preventing falls becomes just as important, if not more, than focusing only on bone measurements. I usually explain it like this. Imagine trying to protect something fragile. You can make the object stronger, or you can reduce the chances of it being dropped in the first place. Both matter. But preventing the fall often has the biggest impact. Balance, strength, environment. These are the factors that influence whether a fall happens at all. Simple things can make a real difference. Improving balance through gentle movement, removing obstacles at home, ensuring proper lighting, checking vision regularly. These are not complicated steps, but they directly affect real-world outcomes. Now, this doesn't mean medication is never appropriate. There are situations where it can be helpful and necessary. But the key point is this. The decision should not feel automatic. It should be part of a broader conversation. Questions like, what is my actual fracture risk? How much benefit can I expect from this medication? What else can I do to reduce risk? Because when you look at the full picture, you often find that multiple small actions together create the strongest protection. Now let's move to the final checkup. This one is not as widely discussed, but it's one of the most important to understand, because it shows very clearly how a well-intentioned test can sometimes lead to outcomes people never expected. Now let's talk about the last checkup. This is one that many people have never even heard about, until it suddenly appears in a recommendation: an ultrasound of the arteries in your neck. It sounds simple, non-invasive, quick. The idea is straightforward. Check if there is any narrowing in the vessels that carry blood to your brain. And if something is found, take action to reduce future risk. On the surface, that sounds logical. But here's where we need to slow down and look more carefully. Changes in blood vessels are very common with age. Many people develop some degree of narrowing over time and never experience symptoms from it. The body adapts, circulation adjusts, life continues normally. But when these changes are detected through screening, they can lead to decisions about intervention. And those interventions are not always minor. They may involve procedures designed to remove or reduce the narrowing. And while those procedures can be helpful in certain situations, especially when symptoms are present, they also carry risks. Because working directly with blood vessels means working in a very sensitive system. Even small complications can have significant effects. So once again, the key question becomes, is this test helping guide necessary care? Or is it identifying something that may never have caused a problem? And if something is found, will the next step actually improve long-term outcomes? Because the goal is not just to find changes. The goal is to protect your quality of life, your independence, your daily comfort. Now I want to bring everything together, because what we've discussed today is not about avoiding medical care. It's about understanding how decisions change over time, and how to stay actively involved in those decisions. So here's something practical you can take with you. Anytime a new test is suggested, especially if you feel well, pause for a moment and ask a few simple questions, not to challenge your doctor, but to understand the full picture. For example, what are we looking for with this test? How likely is it to find something meaningful in my situation? If something is found, what are the next steps? What are the risks of those steps? Are there non-invasive alternatives or ways to monitor instead? These questions shift the conversation. They move it from automatic decisions to informed decisions. And that makes a difference. Because after a certain age, healthcare is not just about adding more interventions. It's about choosing the right ones, at the right time, for your specific situation. The goal is not to collect more findings. The goal is to support how you actually live, your energy, your independence, your ability to do what matters to you. And sometimes protecting that means doing less, but doing it more thoughtfully. So here's one small thing I'd like you to do. Before your next appointment, take a moment and think about what matters most to you in your health. Not just numbers or results, but your day-to-day life. Because when that becomes part of the conversation, everything changes. If this gave you a new perspective, consider sharing it with someone you care about. Sometimes the right information at the right time can make a meaningful difference. And if you want more content like this, simple, clear, practical, you can follow along for future videos. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.